Hello everybody, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I have my April wrap up for you guys. So April was truly a terrible month. Reading wise, I didn't read a whole ton. Like, I read a decent amount. I'm not mad about the amount that I read, but it was definitely my worst reading month of the year in terms of the amount of pages that I read, and the quality of the books was not there either. So I don't know if this is going to turn out to be a ranty wrap up, because honestly I just don't feel like I have the energy to go that hard for these books that I didn't enjoy this month. But there was only one book in April that I rated higher than 3 stars. So it's been a time. But before we get into my stats for the month and the reviews of all of the books that I read in April, I would first like to introduce you guys to the sponsor of today's video, which is of course the wonderful Book of the Month. So once again, a big thank you to Book of the Month for continuing to support my channel. If you guys are unfamiliar with Book of the Month at all, they are a US only book curation service that bring you guys a selection of the hottest titles and releases of the month for you to choose from for a price that is cheaper than you can find them anywhere else, as well as the selection of 5 to 7 books they provide as the titles of the month. They also have an extensive catalogue of add-ons that they add to regularly that you can add to your subscription for, once again, a price cheaper than you will be able to find them anywhere else. So I'm going to be showing you guys the May books that I am most excited about, and there are actually quite a few this month. So one of the ones that I'm most excited about is The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. This one, it says in the synopsis that it is Mexican Gothic meets Rebecca. I have yet to read Mexican Gothic, but Rebecca is, I think, my favorite classic, and I am obsessed with like the Hitchcock movie. I really love it. So anything that's going to deliver those like dark spooky Gothic vibes and also a haunted house, which I believe this one has, is right up my alley. For the fantasy pick for May, we have Darling Girl by Liz Mikulski. This one is super intriguing because it is a reimagining of Peter Pan that brings the story into the 21st century, and it is following the granddaughter of Wendy. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Peter Pan as a story, but I love Peter Pan as a character. But I am super excited to see how this brings the story into a modern contemporary setting. For romance, we have Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. This one is a contemporary age gap romance following an ER doctor and a carpenter who is 10 years younger than her. And then the thriller pick for the month is Breathless by Amy McCulloch. This one centers around a mountaineering expedition that goes very, very wrong as the climbers start to die one by one. And then as an add-on for this month, we have a release that I know is super anticipated for a ton of people, which is Book of Night by Holly Black, which is her first adult fantasy release. It's actually a lot shorter than I anticipated it being, and I am excited to give this one a go because I haven't been a huge fan of Holly Black's YA stuff. I don't agree with her writing style, but as she's now published her first adult book, I feel like if I'm ever going to give her books a try again, this is the one that I'm going to be going for. So once again, a very exciting stack of books from Book of the Month. If you would like to check out Book of the Month for yourself, please do not hesitate to click on the link right at the top of my description box, enter the code Becca at checkout, and get your very first book of the month for just $9.99. Okay, so getting into those stats, it is quite painful this month. In the month of April, I read a total of 3,108 pages, which broke down to an average of 104 pages per day. For the star ratings, I had 3 2-star reads, 3 3-star reads, and 1 4-star, which broke down to an average of 2.7 stars per book. This is tragic. For the demographics, we had 1 young adult, 2 new adult, and 4 adults. For the formats, I read 4 ebooks, 2 physical books, and listened to 1 audiobook. For the genres, we had 3 fantasy, 3 fantasy romance, and 1 romance. So all of my favorite genres, but still not getting any hits. And for the places where I sourced these books from, 4 of them were from Kindle Unlimited, and 3 of them I have hauled in 2022. In April, I did participate in 2 readathons as well. The first one was the Magical Readathon hosted by G of Book Roast. I'm not going to go into the details of the readathons here. I just kind of want to recap my progress really briefly. And the second one was Realmathon hosted by Cass from Covers with Cassidy. So for Magical Readathon, I did achieve the calling of Demonologist. I had to rearrange some books. I did have 2 DNFs actually in April, which I think I forgot to tell you. So that just makes makes my reading month even worse, but I had to rearrange some prompts, but I did manage to get the requirements I needed for Demonologist and Realmathon. I feel like I did okay. I had quite a lot of high scoring books for my team, but obviously I didn't end up reading a whole ton. Getting into the books that I actually read in the month and what I thought about them. The first book that I read was The Name of All Things by Jen Lyons. This is the second book in the Chorus of Dragons series, and the first book, which is Ruin of Kings, I really enjoyed. I gave 4 stars to. This sadly just did not live up to the same level for me, and I ended up giving this one 2 stars. So in this series we are following a guy called Kieran who has been destined to destroy the world. Something that I really loved about Ruin of Kings is that the story is told from 2 points in time from 2 different perspectives. So the book opens up where a character asks Kieran to tell her his life story. So he starts telling the story in first person, and the person he's telling the story to interrupts him and says like, no, that's not where the story starts, and they start telling the story in third person from an earlier point in time up until the timelines kind of converge. So what I really wanted from this book was for it to continue on from that point and kind of like reinforce everything that we'd already established in the first book. However, this book is exactly the same thing as the first one again, but telling the story of a different character called Janelle. It was kind of frustrating because after it took so long, because it's a very confusing series to get into. We have characters that have been reincarnated, characters that are supposed to be dead but escaped death, or are supposed to be dead and were resurrected. We have people who have jumped into other people's bodies using various like magical artifacts and things like that. So it's a very confusing book to read to start off with, and after going through all the confusion in the first book, I kind of wanted us to iron out some things instead of adding more confusion and a whole ton more characters into the mix, which is just ultimately what this book did for me. I'd also got to a point where I was really invested in Kieran's story, and this took me away from that, even though Kieran is still a part of this story, and I'm assuming that Janelle is going to become relevant. Well, Janelle is relevant, but when the story actually starts to progress forward again, she's obviously going to be a major player. I just felt like the unique way that the first book was told that I really enjoyed became a little bit of a gimmick in this one, and wasn't as effective at all, and seemed to be like a quirky for the sake of being quirky kind of thing, as opposed to like a really unique way of telling a story. So this one was not a hit for me, but I am going to continue with the series because just as I was actually about to DNF this book, somebody commented on one of my videos and said that they think that this book is the weakest in the series, and that books 1 and 2 serve as like kind of a prequel for the rest of the series. So I am going to continue, but I think if I don't enjoy book 3, then I may have to give up on this one because the books are really big as well. But I am really sad about this because I did really love the first book. I then read the only book that I truly enjoyed for the month, which was Fires of Vengeance by Evan Winters. This one is the sequel to Rage of Dragons. It's an adult epic high fantasy series following a guy called Tao, whose life is pretty much already laid out for him because of the society that he lives in. He's one of the common people, and there's this ongoing war between Tao's people and pretty much the rest of the world, which Tao's people refer to as heathens. So to keep this war going, they constantly draft men into the military and then train them up to essentially just be the fodder on the front lines of this war. And Tao comes to a point where he decides that this isn't really what he wants for his life, and he's trying to figure out a way to get out of it when something tragic happens to his family and his community. And from that point on, he is on like a very singular driven revenge mission to punish the people who have hurt his family and his community. So I gave this one 4.5 stars. I listened to the audiobook, which would definitely recommend. The narrator's voice for this series is like butter and really adds something to the story. But my one criticism of the first book wasn't really a criticism and more of an observation, because it is very intentional on behalf of the author. But Tao is so driven on his mission that everything else about his personality kind of just doesn't exist. He lets everything about himself go so that he can just be a tool to achieve his mission. As somebody who is a character driven reader, the one thing that stopped me from really loving the first book is that I wasn't super connected to Tao because of the way that he has distanced himself to just be a vessel for this rage and revenge to existing pretty much. So one thing that I do really love about this series is that I find the character development to be very believable. Like throughout the first book, I thought that Tao's training was very realistic, and I could very clearly see like how he was becoming the person that he was at the end of book one, as opposed to like where he started at the beginning of book one. And his character continues to progress very realistically throughout this one as well. In this one, he really starts to become more aware of himself and aware of how like toxic this revenge mission is when he's pursuing it to the extremes that he is. He's also more aware of the people around him. I still love the cast of side characters in here. I also really liked the main female character of this one. There is a romance subplot that runs throughout this series, which in the first book I found was quite unnecessary and I wasn't really feeling it, but there's more developing in this one that I enjoyed a little bit more. And something that I really loved about this is that towards the end there is a chapter from the perspective of a character whose perspective we do not see up until this point, and I thought that narrating those particular events from that character's perspective was genius, and it was my favorite thing about the whole book. That's all I can really say about that part of the book because spoilers, but I loved it so much and I thought that it was so well done. The plot also continues to grow throughout this series. In book one, we're mainly focused on Tao's training montage essentially and his character development, where the plot starts to come in towards the end and like develops throughout book two. So I'm really intrigued to see where the plot is going to go in book three actually, because we have like a couple of turning points throughout this book that are going to shift the focus I think throughout the latter two books of the series. But yeah, the only book that I truly enjoyed from this month, so would definitely recommend picking up this series if you haven't already, and if you are a fan of audiobooks then definitely check out the audiobook. Something very small that I read that I haven't recorded in my spreadsheet so isn't part of the stats, but like I'll just talk about it briefly here, is the first half of Buffy the Vampire Slayer Chosen Ones. So this is a collection of short stories that go along with the Buffy reboot comic, and I did only read half of it because in the reading order for the comic it told me to just read that first section, and the second half of this gets read when I'm a little bit later into the series. So I haven't recorded it anywhere because it is like half of a comic. It was like 40-50 pages if that, and it was just 3 very short stories about slayers throughout history. So if you're unfamiliar with Buffy the Vampire Slayer, it is about the girl who is the current vampire slayer, and every time a slayer dies a new one is chosen, and they are the one person who has to fight back against the forces of evil. So the majority of Buffy the Vampire Slayer obviously follows Buffy, the current slayer, but this is looking into some of the slayers throughout history. So it went back to the 1700s. I think one of these was in a little bit earlier. We had 2 1800s and 1 1400s, and considering that these were just very short stories in comic form, so not very much there at all, they did a really good job actually of conveying what they were supposed to. I thought that the atmosphere came across very well. The first one talks a little bit about colonialism and racism, which I found was incredibly interesting, and I feel like they did a very good job considering the first short story is like 10-15 pages long. So yeah, I actually really enjoyed this. There's obviously not a lot for me to review because it's 40 pages of a comic, but it is something that I did read throughout the month. Then we move on to all of my colossal disappointments. So I read the first 2 books in the Zodiac Academy series on Kindle Unlimited. Book 1 is The Awakening and book 2 is Ruthless Fae, and people have been hounding me to read the series for a long time, but people do say that this series only gets good when you get to around book I think like 3 or 4. So when I went into these first 2 books I wasn't really expecting a lot, which is great because I didn't really get a lot out of these. So the books are quite long. The first one's like 400 and something pages, the second one is close to 500, and they get longer with every installment. But this series is about twins who have been raised in the mortal world, and then they find out that not only are they fae, but they are also the lost heirs of the Fae Kingdom, and they're taken to the Zodiac Academy where they are trained in their abilities and their powers. They encounter many problems when they arrive at the Zodiac Academy. One of them is that they've been raised in the mortal world, so they have no idea about magic themselves, like the politics, the systems in the Fae world. And the second problem is actually a set of problems, and that is the Celestial Heirs, which are these 4 young men who are the current heirs to the Celestial Council. So when they come of age they will take their parents' places, and they have been ruling since the twins father died, the king, who I think they call him something like the Mad King. It's not the Mad King because that's Game of Thrones, but essentially he wasn't a great guy. The Celestial heirs took control, and now they're feeling threatened because these twin girls have arrived and are supposedly going to be ousting them from their thrones and then taking their rightful place on the throne. So I knew that this was a bullying romance going into it, and like I said, I knew that it's only supposed to get good a little bit later in the series, but I just did not have a good time with the first two books. They're very poorly written. Something that really bugged me throughout reading the first book is that the main character wore Converse shoes, but every time she put them on, it would say she put on her Converses instead of Converse, and it was just little things like that that really bugged me throughout the reading of this. But I also found it to be incredibly repetitive because we have two main characters as well. It was telling the same events through both of their eyes in like a slightly different way. So when they arrive at this school, the houses of this school are based on the elements, and whichever element you're strongest in will be the house that you join. So it would tell the initiation into the houses from the perspective of each of the characters, who are part of different houses, so it is slightly different, but it's just felt like the story was longer because we were going through like the same event twice from each of their perspectives. Also, in terms of the romantic elements in here, there's not really any romance in book one at all. In book two, I would say it is very minor, and because the plot is kind of drawn out, it just makes the whole thing really tedious because it's not really delivering on anything that I'm expecting from it. Also, there is no romance in book one. Like, it's supposed to be a bully romance. There's no romance, it's just bullying, and I would even say it's like assault in these books. I have only read one bully romance before, which was Punk 57 by Penelope Douglas, that I did really enjoy, and there was no, the thing that I love about Punk 57 is while there are elements of bullying in there, there's also like sexual tension between the characters, and I just don't feel like there is any sexual tension in Zodiac Academy at all. So it just feels like assault, and it's not hot. The faculty, the teachers at this school are all sexual predators, a little bit creepy. They're not teachers. They don't have the well-being of their students as like any sort of primary concern, I guess. So it was just an uncomfortable read throughout most of it. I am going to continue until at least book 3 because that's the point, I guess, where people have said it gets better. And there are two male characters that I'm vaguely interested in. I'm really invested in Professor Orion, actually, and for the Celestial Heirs, I'm really intrigued about Darius. Caleb could possibly turn it around, but I hate Seth. Like, Seth makes my skin crawl, and Max, I could like barely tell you anything about him. So I feel like we have more heirs than we need here because I really don't care about the majority of them. And I gave both of these books 2 stars. I was surprised that the first book didn't come out as 1 star, but I found that by the time I got to the end, while it hadn't actually got any better, I didn't like hate it anymore. So it got 2. Another book that I read on Kindle Unlimited was River of Shadows by Karina Halley. This is the second book that I've read from Karina Halley. Sadly, I did not love this one either. It came out as a 3-star for me. This is the first book in an adult fantasy romance duology that has a whole ton of Finnish mythology in it, and we are following a young woman who is from, I think she's from somewhere in California, and she finds out her father died, so she travels over to Lapland for his funeral, and she goes to the resort that her father owns, and the people who work there are being really creepy. So she's feeling quite unsettled about the way that they're behaving, and she goes down to the room in the middle of the night where like the funeral is going to be, opens her father's casket, and he isn't in it. So she's really confused. Somebody appears out of nowhere and starts telling her like her father isn't dead. These creepy people are being creepy, and the main character decides that she is going to take a leap of faith and believe in this guy who's told her that her father isn't dead and travel down into the underworld to save him. So the majority of this book, like I would say the first half of this book, is kind of a little bit of a whimsical adventure of these two characters traveling down into the underworld, but then the story changes quite a bit, and the romance isn't what I thought it was, because I know it's fantasy romance. The romance was established in a different way than I expected it to be, although when it was established, like it did make a whole ton of sense. I enjoyed this one more than I enjoyed Black Sunshine by Karina Halley. I gave it 3 stars, so it was like nothing amazing, but I did like kind of like it. I enjoyed the Finnish mythology because I don't think I've read anything with Finnish mythology in it before. It gave me kind of Sorcery of Thorns vibes throughout that first half where these two characters were were on this like whimsical adventure. And then throughout the second half, I enjoyed the smut and I'm very intrigued about the romantic nature of the story and how it's going to progress. My kind of thing that really disappointed me with this is that it ends really abruptly, so it doesn't feel like the first book is like a book, because it just kind of ended in quite an anticlimactic way. Like something happened, but not in a typical like conflict and resolution end of book kind of style, which just isn't personally to my taste. I think I'm going to continue and read the sequel to this, which I believe is either out now or it's out at some point in May, but I believe it'll be available on Kindle Unlimited. So I am intrigued enough to continue with the story, but it was like nothing amazing. The last thing that I read on Kindle Unlimited was very short. It was the first part of the Never Never serial by Colleen Hoover and Taryn Fisher, which has been on my TBR because I want to kind of read everything by Colleen Hoover eventually. And this is not like her super early work, but it is much earlier in her career than she is now. I've never read anything from Taryn Fisher before either, so I didn't really know what to expect from this, but it was kind of very typical like YA romancy, and it is following these two teenagers who have lost all of their memories. So they have amnesia, and it starts off like at the moment that they've lost their memory, so they've kind of just not even woke up, because it happens like in the middle of the day, not like in the morning, but they're kind of just suddenly aware that they don't know where they are or who they are or why they're there. And throughout the course of the like early stages of this amnesia, they recognize the same kind of signs in each other and that they both have lost all of their memories. So they start to investigate it together, and like the premise of this book is that these two people have been best friends since they were children. They've been in love since they were 14, and now they have no idea like who they are or who each other is, but they're assuming that it's connected to them in some way because it's happening to both of them. So I gave this first installment, it was only like 150 pages and it is a serial, so it was very much set up, and I gave it 3 stars because you know how amnesia stories are tedious because it just kind of keeps re-establishing that the characters don't know who they are and what they're doing. It was tedious like that, but I don't feel like I can judge it too harshly because it is an amnesia story and it's only like the first part of it, like the setup. I will say that it was decently compelling in a way that makes me want to continue and find out what happens, because at this point I don't even know what's caused the amnesia, whether it's like a sci-fi element, a paranormal element, fantasy, like contemporary. I don't know what's going on, but I'm intrigued enough to find out. And then we move on to another stack of disappointments, which is the Goldsboro vlog that was supposed to go up before this video. I don't think it is now, so you will see this first, but I DNF'd 2 of the 3 books, and essentially like mentally I haven't been doing too well throughout the end of April, and also like where we're at now in May, still not 100% like at all. It hasn't been a good time, but I just wasn't in the mindset to struggle through books that I knew that I wasn't going to enjoy, so I did DNF these 2 pretty early on. The first one was Absent by Brendan P. Bellicourt, which you guys will know was the one out of the 3 that I didn't think I was going to enjoy. I did make it 86 pages into this one, so like I said, not very far, but by that point we were already in our 4th gunfight of the book, and it was all very like 1920s gangster movie style, which is just really not for me, so I knew pretty early on that I just didn't want to read that one. And then the other one that I DNF'd was The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. I think I made about 80-90 pages into this one as well, and I just didn't like the tone of the narrator in this. This one is following a traveling justice, but it's through the perspective of his secretary slash apprentice, and it was just very, I don't want to say pretentious. There is a murder mystery in here, and it was leaning very much into the murder mystery plotline, which, as you guys know, like murder mystery is not something that I typically enjoy as a genre, and the fantastical elements weren't prominent enough for me to care enough to continue. But I will say that the way that the world was built was interesting. I just did not want to continue. And then the one that I did read was sadly just a 3-star, which was Age of Ash by Daniel Abraham. This one's an adult fantasy. I think it's the first book in a trilogy, and this one is about a thief called Alice whose brother has been murdered, and she desperately wants to figure out what happened to him, so she retraces his footsteps to get to the bottom of what he was involved in, because like her, he was also a thief, and she finds herself embroiled in this like much bigger political plot line that she's not quite equipped to handle. We also have another main character in here who is Alice's friend, who has agreed to go along with her on this mission because she's in love with Alice, and she also ends up wrapped up in the politics, but kind of from a different angle. And I did find this book quite difficult to get into because the series is called Kithamar, so it's about the city of Kithamar as opposed to the people, and it's going from the angle of like the people make up the city. So throughout the beginning of this, we would have like random perspectives from characters who were like related to the main characters but not super prominent in the plot, and they would kind of help to form the world building, I guess. And then because this book is so focused on the city, it's kind of like a character driven story, but if the city was the character. So in the middle of like a character going somewhere, it would like describe the architecture and like very small details like that, or you would pass a group of people doing something and it would like go through the societal customs and why they were doing whatever it is they're doing in this moment. I did struggle throughout the first half of this, but as the political plotline grew, I did start to enjoy it a little bit more, and the second half was a little bit better, although I will say I wasn't particularly connected to any of the main characters, and I am, as I've mentioned, quite a character driven reader. Something that I did really enjoy about this is that it does really focus on the grief that Alice feels for her brother. So you'll find if you have a story set up like this is quite a typical fantasy plot, that somebody is trying to find out what happened to a loved one that's died, and that will kind of be the catalyst that gets like brushed under the rug a little bit as the story goes on. Something that I really appreciated about this is that the death of the main character's brother still stays central to the plot and her motivations, and she struggles with her grief even though sometimes she doesn't realize that that's what she's doing, and that what she's doing is part of her grieving and struggling to process the death of her brother. It does remain prevalent throughout the entirety of this book, and there are some like really great lines about grief throughout here as well. But overall, I had to give it 3 stars because I really just struggled through the first half of this one. So there you have it. Those were all of the incredibly disappointing books that I read in the month of April. I am hoping for better things from me, but quite honestly, I'm not too hopeful overall, because as I just mentioned, like I have been struggling mentally throughout the end of April. I'm still struggling mentally now, and it is causing me to just not want to read. Like I've barely picked up a book in the last few days, so until I kind of like get through this, I don't really feel like my reading is going to be quite there, which is unfortunate because there is a whole ton that I was really excited to read in May. But I mean, we're still in the early days, so like anything's possible at this point. But down in the comments, please let me know what you guys read in the month of April and which was your favorite book of April. Once again, a big thank you to Book of the Month for sponsoring this video, and don't forget, if you'd like to check out Book of the Month for yourself, you can head into my description box, click the link at the top, enter the code Becca at checkout, and get your very first Book of the Month for just $9.99. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go and nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.